stimulate the economy. It isn't just the taxes that are holding us down, it's overregulation. I have met with business owners in this district who are quitting. They're giving up because they're tired of just being overregulated by the federal government. Overregulation has also brought in a new concept called overcriminalization. Because with the power that the executive branch has taken, and Congress has allowed them to do it over the years, not just in this administration, but previous administrations as well, we now have a situation of overcriminalization because of these regulatory environments. I was reading a story the other day of a gentleman from Maine who spent 6 months in prison. The terrible crime that he committed was he ordered some lobsters from overseas that were shipped to him in plastic containers instead of cardboard containers. This is the result of overregulation. I met with a doctor the other day, 43-year-old physician, who is quitting his practice and going into drafting. Scott may be able to pick up a new employee there. Because he said, I can't grow my business because I'm being overregulated through HIPAA regulations, I'm being overregulated through the Affordable Care Act, and now I can't even get capital because at Dodd-Frank I can't get capital to expand my business. I'm tired of the regulation, I'm giving up, and because of that, it's not only going to cost him, but it's going to cost all those employees that are working with him as well.
Thank you, Gary. Would you like to read that question again, Mr. Carr?
No, although we just witnessed something that we have a problem with in the Congress, and that's germaneness. Not quite sure what all of that had to do with the question. The question, I think, as I remember, was reducing to 20% or below the rate of taxation on corporate income. And the answer to that is absolutely. And there is very real-world experience to show that that sort of tax reduction does result in virtually immediate and very possibly long-term gains for the economy. Back in 1997, for example, when we passed the Balanced Budget Act and got Clinton to actually sign it because we defined the playing field, part of that legislation was tax reduction. Now, the particular tax reduction that we were able to get through the Congress and get Clinton to sign was a dramatic decrease in the rate of taxation on capital gains. Not exactly the same as a reduction in corporate tax rates, but the effect was very similar. What we ought to be doing, rather than simply satisfying ourselves at reducing to 20% the corporate tax rate, we ought to do what other countries, a number of other countries have done, and that is what we used to do, and that is to lead in terms of economic freedom. A number of other countries who are now surpassing us in their rate of increase of corporate and industrial output and increase in GDP have not only reduced their corporate tax rate, but have eliminated it altogether. That would be a recipe for a dramatic, startling, long-term economic boom in this country.
Thank you. The next question is to both of you again, and frankly, it kind of comes on the heels of this question. So, somewhat related. We've had a difficult time at the federal level passing a budget. We've had a difficult time writing a budget, even coming up with discussing a budget, let alone coming up with a balanced budget. What policy would you advocate and pursue and promote relative to balancing the federal budget, assuming that's a goal you agree with?
Well, I obviously agree with it because I've been there and done it. There are basically two ways. I mean, some folks think that the only way you can balance the federal budget is through balanced budget amendment, which isn't true. That is one way that you can move in that direction, and that's why I supported, when I was in the House before, as part of the contract with America, a balanced budget amendment. We weren't able to get sufficient votes, but we did try. Unfortunately, even with the balanced budget amendments that have been proposed, they contain sufficient loopholes in them, so they don't even guarantee that you're going to be able to balance the budget. The bottom of the line is the only way we will ever get a balanced budget. And it's precisely what we did in 1997, where we actually achieved a balanced budget, is to insist that we have men and women in the Congress, particularly in the House. This is where the House leads, the Senate talks, the House acts. We defined the budgetary playing field by refusing to allow any budget proposal that this president wants to come to the floor of the House for a vote. That will, in fact, force him to the negotiating table, whether Harry Reid likes it or not. That's how we did obtain a balanced budget. And we sustained it only for, I think, 3.5 years, unfortunately. But the reason it disappeared had nothing to do with whether or not we had a balanced budget. It had to do with a Congress and a president not having the backbone to stick with it. And we as the American people sadly did not insist that they do it. It has to start here, and it ends up there by having a Congress that knows how to use and has the backbone to use, the courage to use, the power of the purse strings over and over and over again and force a bad president to his knees.
Thank you.
Good question.
Would you let me read to you?
No, I think I've got it.
All right.
I think the evidence of why we have to have a constitutional amendment to force the balanced budget is exactly what you heard the answer that Bob gave. Once we balanced the budget in the past 20 or 30 years. Our founding fathers realized that no legislative body, regardless of which party was in charge, as time would go on, would willingly reduce its own power or its ability to spend money. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said his only criticism of the Constitution was that it did not put a limit on the amount of money that Congress could borrow. We have an $18 trillion debt that Congress, even under Republican authority, has built. That debt is so great. To give you an idea how big that debt is, if you were to go back to the birth of Christ and you put $16,000 in the bank every 60 seconds since the birth of Christ, you still wouldn't have $18 trillion today. 16.9 trillion. Just the interest payment on the debt alone. Just the interest payment we paid last year was enough to buy over 2,700 F-35 fighters at $151 million apiece. It's a national security issue. It doesn't matter who is in control. It'd be great to say if we got a fully conservative body in there. We have a growing number of conservatives in Congress. I sat around the table with many of them just Monday and Tuesday of this week in Washington, D.C. In fact, I even talked with Paul Ryan, who has written the current budget. I don't think he's aggressive enough, but he's done a lot of good things in that budget. The budget is critical. The budget is so critical because that's the power that Congress has to hold the executive branch in check. We need Congress to pass a balanced budget amendment to go into effect by at least the year 2030, which would be the catalyst to get this nation back on track.
Thank you. Where's Diane? Diane? She out there? I've got 3 questions left. Do we think we have time for all 3, or should I make some choices?
Yeah, we got.
We have time? Yes? Okay. No quick. Questions for both candidates, and it has to do with immigration. Do you believe that we have an illegal immigration problem in the U.S.? There goes the first answer. Do you believe we have an illegal immigration problem in the U.S.? And if so, what is both your short and long-term solution to the problem? And we're going to start with you.
Okay. Short-term solution is enforce the laws we have in the books already. Now, you asked a question earlier about experience as a state legislature. Well, one of the things that I think brings a lot of credibility serving in Congress is because a lot of what Congress does affects the states because they're doing a lot of things they shouldn't do. And taking the experience of what these regulations and this legislation does to the states, I think is extremely valuable in Washington, D.C. D.C. And I think having that state level experience is extremely valuable. Immigration is one of those issues because the federal government is not enforcing the laws it has on the books. It has put that burden on the states, but yet the federal government says you have no authority in that. We must enforce the laws we have on the books. Second, we must seal the border. We must not have open borders. We must restrict immigration into this nation. Everyone coming in must be coming in for a purpose and must be allowed to come in, and they need to be checked. We also need to fix our legal immigration system. Our legal immigration system is broken. It takes sometimes 15 years for somebody to legally migrate into this nation. I sat with a couple when I was in the state Senate. I worked on a piece of legislation that we pushed through the Senate. We weren't able to get it through the House. But it prohibited illegal aliens from being able to attend our public universities on our taxpayer dollars. They were taking seats from veterans that were coming back from Afghanistan. And while I was working on that legislation, I sat with a migrant couple who had already spent 12 years trying to legally migrate, spent over $12,000 in legal fees. And yet, everything was in order, and they were told by the federal government, well, we're just still processing it, so you just need to stay here illegally, because if you go back, then you got to start all over again. And finally, we have to have a workable and traceable work visa program so that we can allow migrant workers to come in. We know where they are, and we know when it's time for them to go back home, they're taken home.
Wow. Would you like to repeat the question again?
No, if I remember correctly, I think the first part of it kind of set the tone and the parameters for the question, and that is, do we have an illegal immigration problem in this country? And you can answer that with another question, does it rain during the summertime in Georgia? Of course we do. Even those folks in Washington who are figuratively, if not literally, standing at the border and saying, come on in, hijos, niños, come on in. They know that we have a serious problem, except they do not have either the wherewithal, the interest, or the inclination to do something about it. What we need to do on the illegal immigration front is not only to enforce the laws, and here Congress can do something about it as well, but to demand through the appropriations process that the people who are on our borders, guarding our borders, do that and not give free legal advice to people coming across illegally, and not, as my good friend Sheriff Joe Arpaio said, spend their time changing diapers rather than enforcing the laws on the borders. In the short term, I believe what we need to do is take all of these folks that are coming across, and many of them are children, many of them are teenage gangbangers as well, and instead of giving them free legal advice and shipping them to communities across America that don't want them, but which will make it almost impossible to ever get them back and deport them, we need to be sending them back to the country across whose border they came, and that is Mexico. We need to be demanding that Mexico do something about this problem, because they are a great deal of the problem. In the long term, what we need to do is we need to not only modify today, but constantly modify our legal visa and work permitting system so it meets the needs and reflects the needs of businesses on a current basis.
And I want to, at this point, give you all a great sense of relief.
You're going to lower the thermostat.
No, I wish I could do that. But I'm going to do something even better. I'm going to tell you that we actually have more time than I thought. I flew in from Central Time. So I just discovered that we have another hour. It's awesome. It's like, yeah, we got it. So I apologize if I confused you. That's only because I was confused. And we've addressed that, and I've changed kind of on my watch, so I apologize. I was looking down and totally forgot that I had not done that. So the next question, and we'll begin with you, Bob, is pretty straightforward. It's a question of both of you. It has to do with presidential power and authority at the executive level, executive power and authority. Do you believe that our current president, and I will not mention his name, that our current President Obama is operating outside of his constitutional authority, i.e. the appointment of czars, executive orders, and that sort of thing. If so, where do you see that, and how would you work to rein it in?
The answer to the question is absolute. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We see it through some of his executive orders. We see it through some of his so-called signing statements. For example, when the last National Defense Authorization Act was passed, there was a specific, very explicit provision in it. No room for vagueness. Very explicit provision that if the president wishes to release persons from Guantanamo who are in detention there, he has to notify Congress at least 30 days prior to taking that action. When the president got that National Defense Authorization Act, he didn't like that provision in it. So he issued a signing statement saying, I'm not going to abide by that. It interferes with my authority. And sure enough, true to his word in this instance, when the time came, as we saw just recently with the Bergdahl case and the whole issue there, the president simply refused to abide by the law, released 5 very dangerous detainees without notifying the Congress. That is just one of a number of instances in which this president, whether it's in the immigration area, the healthcare area, other areas, where this president is deliberately flouting the law. There are several things that Congress can in fact do, and we saw Speaker Boehner yesterday announce one of those, that the House of Representatives is going to sue the president for those actions. This is very important, not unprecedented, but it rarely happens, and that's good. We have also seen in recent years at least some court decisions by federal courts, including the Supreme Court, to rein in unconstitutional uses of power by the president. Most recently today, the U.S. Supreme Court said what this president did in naming people as recess appointees while Congress was not in recess to the National Labor Relations Board was unconstitutional. The Congress has the power, the purse strings to stop this, they have the power to sue, and they have the power to stand up to the president by passing laws that contradict what he is doing.
So you want to read that question?
Repeat, I just want to make sure I get all of that answered. You don't have that. I think pretty much.
You and Lois Lerner.
This is with respect to presidential authority. Do you believe that President Obama is operating outside of his constitutional authority with the appointment of czars, executive orders, etc.? Where is this occurring, in your opinion, and what would you do? How would you rein it in?
Absolutely, he is working outside the boundaries of the Constitution. In fact, in executive orders, if you look at the pure number of executive orders that Obama has passed, they're actually fewer in number than the previous 2 presidents, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. But it's the scope of what his executive orders do that is the problem. He is flat out ignoring the laws that are passed by Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution says all legislative powers are vested in Congress. Legislative power means the ability to pass law. Law is any restriction upon liberty. When you look at what's going on with the EPA, that's a restriction of your liberties. When they just arbitrarily pass anything that restricts your ability, your freedom to make a living, your freedom to choose whether you choose health care or not, which, again, Congress has passed that, but you ought to have the ability to choose if you want to pay for health care. And then Obama goes out and just arbitrarily changes the law because he don't even like his own law that he had passed. This is not only violations of the Constitution, it's violations of our liberties, our rights, and our freedoms. We talk a whole lot about Obamacare and how it's putting a cramp on our economy, and we're losing health insurance. But we tend to forget that it's a liberty issue. It's a freedom issue. The president has to be reined in. Bob has brought up the exact instances. The Constitution gives the power to Congress to rein these executive branches in, but we have not shown the fortitude to do that. One reason is because we hadn't had a budget. Budget is one of the key areas of which we can rein in the executive branch, and we haven't even done that. So we must have the fortitude to go back again, force Congress to have a balanced budget, use the powers that are given to Congress to rein in the executive. We can get liberty back.
The next question has to do with energy policy, very specific question. What is your stance on the Keystone Pipeline? Would you work to bring American energy to a point of independence? And what would be your plan? How would you do it?
Yes to the Keystone Pipeline, yes to drilling in Anwar, yes to drilling back in Texas. In fact, when I was in Washington this week, I sat across the table from a gentleman from Exxon, and we started talking about energy policy. And he started telling me that there is enough reserves of not only our traditional petroleum resources, such as in Anwar in Alaska, but some of the new technologies where we can tap into some of the shale oil and other things that are actually in the lower 48 of the United States in non-traditional areas, but the federal government will not allow them to tap into these resources. Folks, we are funding our enemies overseas that seek to destroy us and take our liberties. We must have energy independence. I worked in Alaska. I've been to where they have drilled up in the Arctic slope, above the Arctic Circle. And I have seen that when these oil companies leave, you can never tell they were ever there. We have shut down oil production in the United States for bad science. One of the arguments they made for drilling in Anwar, stopping the drilling in Anwar up in the North Slope was, well, it affects the caribou migration. You know that the caribou population has increased since they put the Alaska pipeline in? The caribou hang around the pipeline because it's a little warmer there, and I guess that increases their ability to reproduce. Keeping it family friendly. We have to bring common sense back to government, common sense back to Washington. These are common sense ideas that any person in this room would look beyond all the hype and all the pomp and circumstance that many members of Congress, they enjoy that, and get down to work and get America back to the common sense values, such as drilling. Drill, baby, drill. Build the Keystone Pipeline. Let's get the economy rolling again.
Thank you. Would you like to read the question real quick?
No, that's fine, thank you. Certainly at the broad level, the answer is to, yes, authorize the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. And Congress can help in that regard as well by taking jurisdiction over the veto power now exercised by, of all people, the State Department, which is the one major impediment. Congress can change that. We need to get the federal government out of the energy hampering business. What they're doing is they're playing favorites. We see it sort of on a small scale with Solyndra, although $500 million is not small, but on a small scale compared to the other areas in which they are interfering and artificially and arbitrarily interfering with energy markets, both energy production, transportation, and exporting. It's a problem not only at the federal level, but at the state level as well. We see different states, like New York, for example, refusing to allow the use of new technology, new fracking techniques that Pennsylvania is using, just down the road, basically. Here again, even though I am a firm believer in states' rights, there are areas that cross boundaries of the states in which there is an appropriate role for the federal government, but it's to get out of the market, get out of those things that they are doing that are playing favorites. Which is what they're doing with coal. Coal-fired plants are on their hit list. And that's going to harm us, that's going to hurt us. We are poised, despite all of the things that this administration is doing, we still are poised next year to become the world's largest exporter of energy. think how much more we could be doing if we could unshackle industry across this country. That's what we need to be doing.
But this is for both of you. I'm going to read these questions. The handwriting is creative, so I'm doing my best with that. But I think what the question is asking is, do you support a convention of the states, or an Article 5 convention, even though it is in direct opposition currently to the RNC resolution of 2012?
I don't.
I'm sorry about this.
Thank you. I don't. For several reasons. One, George Soros wants one. And I start my analysis of questions that George Soros likes it. Probably not a great idea, or at least think twice about it. The problem, though, is, and it is an open question to some extent, those folks who advocate for an Article 5 Convention of the States say the states can, in fact, limit the scope of the issues that are dealt with and what's voted on and what isn't. The problem is it's very much an open question. And I don't think something as important as amending the Constitution should be left up to an open question. Because you could be opening a can of serpents, not just worms, but serpents, if you allow that to happen and the decisions go contrary to what you would like to see. Ultimately, though, I believe that Barry said the Declaration of Independence is the greatest document written by the hand of man, which is language I use. I believe that the Constitution is. If we simply abide by the Constitution without worrying about further amendments, if we simply abide by the terms of the Constitution, we can in fact rectify things that are going wrong with this country. That's a tremendously complex process. It involves the Congress, it involves state governments, it involves the president, it involves the federal courts especially. But it's not a question of should we issue more amendments or pass more amendments to the Constitution. Some of them are good, and I voted for a constitutional amendment for balanced budget and term limits. It's not to say some of them are not called for, but opening that process up to states like California, Connecticut, New York, is not something that I think is a risk worth taking.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Any questions?
I've got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm only 51.
You know what I'm going to do?
Or 50. I'm even aging myself now.
The hairline is already.
Yeah. Bob talked about using the powers of the Constitution. He's absolutely right. The power for a convention of states is in Article 5 of the Constitution. Now, I was flying to Washington, D.C. Monday morning, and Rob, my campaign manager, was with me, and he probably got a chuckle because I was doing some of my pleasure reading. I was reading the Federalist Papers. And I was reading Federalist Paper number 58, I believe it was, and it was talking about Article 5. And when you read Federalist Paper number 58, it is clear that the author was putting, the framers of our Constitution put Article 5 in for a time such as this. Now, whether I support an Article 5 convention in Congress is moot because that's a state's issue. You see, Article 5 convention takes that authority to write the amendment away from Congress when Congress fails to act. Our founding fathers knew that Congress, through the nature of human nature and the progression of man, they would do exactly what they're doing now. They would not be responsive. They would not follow the spirit of the Constitution, the ideas of the Constitution. It's just the nature of the progression of man. That's why they wrote the Federalist Papers, so we would get the idea, the spirit of what they truly intended. And they intended for Article 5 to be when Congress would not respond to the will of the people. The proof of that is every constitutional amendment that has been passed by Congress has restricted the power of the states, not their own power. Now, I don't personally believe we'll get as far as actually having a convention of states, even though they've already had the Mount Vernon Summit to establish rules, but I think what they can do is force Congress to act as they get very close to getting this done. That is a power of the Constitution. It empowers the people, we the people. That's why it was put in place, is when Congress would not respond to the people, that we the people, who are the rightful owners of the power of this nation, will hold Congress accountable. And I support the Constitution.
All right, we'll begin with you, Gary, and his question. And these questions get more and more specific to the job you're doing, your credentials, and we'll let you speak to that. You speak best to that, I'm sure, in both cases. Currently, or could you comment on the current leadership of the Republican Party in Congress, Mr. Boehner, and at what level of confidence and what level of support do you have and would you be able to give to the current leadership? And that,
Our current leadership has been a failure. And it's nothing personal against Boehner. I'm sure he's a fine man. In fact, when I was in Washington this week, my comments that I had made, the only candidate in this race had publicly said and asked, would you vote for John Boehner as Speaker? And I said no. Because I believe that positions of leadership like that have a shelf life. I believe the longer you're in those positions, the more difficult it gets, and it clouds your ability to make good decisions. And one of those decisions came down when Speaker Boehner decided to hand over to Barack Obama, the President of the United States, power to raise the debt ceiling without any congressional oversight, without any limit for over a year, with already an $18 trillion debt. That was not the leadership I was looking for. And I said I would not support Boehner as Speaker. He may be Speaker again, and when he's Speaker, I will still make my decisions based on my principles, my ideas. I'll negotiate my preferences, but I won't compromise my principles. If you want to see evidence of that, ask anybody who served with me in the state legislature. When something violates my principles, I stand firm on those. Even through pressures of leadership and even through the other branches of government, I consistently stand firm. But I also know those things that we agree upon, we have to work together and move forward with those. I'm one of those unique candidates across the nation who has been supported by not only Tea Party organizations, but also members of leadership have endorsed my campaign recently. Speaking back, than some others have. Because they see that I can work across to build that bridge that we're going to have for all of us to work together to fix what's wrong with America.
No, I'm fine, thank you. It would be awfully hard to parse or analyze that answer. It's all over the map. The fact of the matter is, there is nothing that the Democrats like more than to drive wedges between Republicans. And allowing yourself, as a Republican, seeking to serve in the House of Representatives, to be drawn into driving a wedge before you are even elected to the Congress to harm the Republican leadership makes no sense unless you're a Democrat or trying to aid the Democrats. There is indeed a time to vote on the leadership of your party.